Hey everybody, John the Other here, and I'm going to read you from something I wrote, beginning with a question. The question is, why is it that no matter how many times feminist lies are debunked, they continue to be repeated? Why does the feminist lie about Super Bowl sex trafficking continue to rear its, honestly, hateful and ignorant head? How is it that men staying home to watch football and drink beer are still smeared by a public lie about sexual exploitation and abuse of helpless, innocent womenfolk? How can this stupid, insulting, and disgusting libel continue to be told year after year in spite of its year after year debunking? Campus feminists, academic feminists, media feminists, even the compliant lapdog feminist appeasing politicians repeat long debunked, multiply debunked, discredited, known to be false facts of the feminist story machine. And when they do repeat these lies, they don't get booed off stage. They don't get pelted with rotten fruit, and they don't get fired from their positions of public trust or, appropriately, lynched on the lawns of houses of government as they should be. Why is this the case? Why does public knowledge of the empiric falsehood of foundational feminist dogma make no noticeable difference in feminism's acceptance in public life, policy, law, and social zeitgeist? For people critical of feminism's excesses, this question and the lack of an answer from feminist advocates drives us towards answers like feminists are sociopaths, they are monsters, they are sadistic, sick-minded people. How else do we explain such things as a woman in Toronto who, when faced with the challenge that 80% of suicides are from a group she deemed her enemies, she responded with a sarcastic recital of the song Cry Me a River? Surely only a sociopath could have such a reaction. And that reaction is, for feminists, not outlandish. It typifies a loud and public and proud contempt for human pain when that pain is felt by anyone outside the preferred victim demographic of women. And how is it that a socio-political movement claiming in public to be nothing more than the belief in equality between the sexes continues to claim oppression for the sex who lives longer? They claim oppression for the group on whom more public funds are spent. They claim oppression for the group taking the majority of seats in higher education. And they claim oppression for the group subjected to less criminal violence than their male counterparts. And none of these facts are controversial or hidden or unknown. But somehow, feminist rhetoric continues to insist it is women who are oppressed, and feminists are not driven from public life by waves of derisive laughter. This is a very profound disconnect between observable reality and socially acceptable fantasy, and it's right in the middle of public life. And for those trying to actually address problems like male suicide, which is to say 4 out of 5 suicides, or homelessness, which is 70 to 90% male homeless, this disconnect manifests in outreach activism being met by outright hostility because it isn't focused on the small minority of suicide and homeless, which is female. Now, if you're going to try to reduce human damage or reduce the number of people killing themselves or dying under highway overpasses, doesn't it make sense to focus on the main population in which any particular problem exists rather than on the outlying fringe minority? The feminist and mainstream rage, then, when vented onto activists trying to address problems like homelessness or suicide in the male population, feels to those activists like public insanity. And if you, reading this or listening to it, happen to be a feminist, your feminist behavior looks to a non-feminist like the behavior of an insane person. But here we come back to that persistent disconnect between observable reality and public acceptance. How is it that feminists can regularly and routinely call for genocide in the form of kill all men? How is it that respected broadcast corporations and publishing companies can talk openly of the casual disposal of the male half of the human race? Are men necessary? The end of men? Are men obsolete? And such publishers and broadcasters are not immediately identified by the public as promoters of genocide, or at least hatred. Questions such as, are men obsolete, are not questions about people. Those are questions to ask about Betamax videotape players or mechanical typewriters. But figures like Maureen Dowd and Hannah Rosen and their ideological sisters are not categorized alongside famously racist public villains like David Duke, nor are they unusual or extreme in their particular brand of selective bigotry among their feminist contemporaries? Meanwhile, observing or commenting on the ongoing absurdist but still very effective public expansion of feminism's domain of influence will certainly earn any male commentator a torrent of public vitriol, starting from the modern version of the word blasphemy, that he is the most shameful of all shameful things, a misogynist. A critic of feminism is probably a manspreader too, which is a person who sits with his legs in a comfortable position when he rides public transit. Am I the one taking crazy pills here? But the burning question remains, how does a movement composed of known lies, obvious hatred, absurdist claims, and clear contempt for reality continue to advance in the public sphere? Storming into a scheduled academic lecture, pulling fire alarms, beating the floor and the walls with bludgeons to intimidate and threaten members of the public is not something that any other group could even get away without mass arrests and criminal charges. And despite this, the preceding is a concise description of academic feminists on Canadian university campuses anytime a non-feminist organization hosts public discussions on social issues facing boys and men. And no feminist pulling a fire alarm is arrested. No student activist wearing a mask or carrying a wooden bludgeon is suspended from their university. The silencing of expression is defended on the basis that disrupting somebody else's speech is itself an expression of free speech, but that a non-feminist's right to speak at their own venue is not constitutionally protected, and in fact, non-feminist speech, if it is not silenced, is itself an act of censorship of feminists. This bears a restatement because it's so insane. Your speech, in the absence of a competing feminist voice, is claimed by feminists to be an act of censorship of them, while their direct disruption and silencing of you, the non-feminist, is claimed to be their legally protected speech, which cannot be legally stopped. The hypocrisy is both stunning and grotesque. And yet, feminist-driven gender studies departments practicing these tactics and defending them with this anti-logical sophistry are not, as departments, disbanded and defunded. The term feminist academic is not treated as the dishonest folly that feminist academics continue to demonstrate. But why? Why, in the continued demonstration of foundational dishonesty, malicious intent, and open insanity, does society not reject feminism as a bad experiment gone horribly wrong? Well, because feminism is not a secular movement. Feminism is not a social movement. Feminism is not a political movement, or at least the political activism of feminism is not its central core. Feminism is a spiritual movement. Feminism is a mystical, esoteric movement in the tradition of Rosicrucians. And feminism's founder is a woman named Helena Petrovna Blavatsky. She was an occultist, a spirit medium, and the founder of the American Theosophical Society in 1875. But this apparent disconnection doesn't end with feminism. It extends into wider public life. I mean, of course, the disconnection between our unease with pain, injury, or distress when felt by people within our culture's identified oppressed demographic, and our indifference towards similar or identical suffering experienced by people outside an identified and designated victim group. Witness the open contempt for newly born male infants, sexually mutilated as a matter of normal policy, while a nearly identical mutilation contemplated for female infants is viewed with horror and loathing. "Oh, you're crying over a little useless flap of skin," they will say, while roughly 200 infants die from shock each year as they are sexually crippled. And the rest, who do not die, experience a neurological trauma which alters their cognitive function for the rest of their lives. And for most people, the contempt for male infants, and for men in general, is not even recognizable to them as contempt. So, where is this disconnect coming from? It's coming from a mystical and religious belief in the divinity, higher spirituality, and evolutionary advancement of feminine nature over and above the comparably primitive, brutish nature of masculinity. I repeat, while feminist, secular, political, and social and legal activism reflects this spiritual belief, it is not a secular belief or philosophy. Feminism is a religious, mystical philosophy. It is a religion, but one which disguises itself as a secular social and political movement. But of course, it's not a religion. That's just hyperbole from a misogynist. People who call feminism a cult or a religion are just making a rhetorical point that the behavior and the practices closely resemble a cult due to the unreasonable and the visibly irrational attitudes of current generation feminists. Well, that's what most anti-feminists think. It's even what I used to think. After all, when challenged on the cultish, irrational behavior and the outlandish claims made by current generation feminists, the rebuttal typically includes a reference to first-wave feminism, which was all about getting women the right to vote and participate in public life in the same way that men did. And after all, even opponents of modern feminism agree that women were correct to demand the right to vote, and men of the time were correct to give them the right to vote just about as fast as the demand could be made in a large-scale way. What almost nobody knows is that those first-wave feminists, those suffragettes fighting for the vote, were almost every single one of them mystics, spirit channelers, psychics, and table-knocking parlor mediums and purveyors of New Age woo. And that New Age woo, the mysticism, the divine feminine enlightenment, and all of its related mummery was not a sideshow. It was not secondary. Getting the vote was secondary. Getting women into the workforce was secondary. Getting women into politics was secondary. Getting women into higher education, both as students and teachers, was secondary. Eroding the Western world's concept of justice and due process, that was secondary, because feminism is not now and never was a secular movement. It began as, and remains today, a religion which, among its practices, keeps its own religious character hidden behind the false facade of being a secular humanist movement. That is why facts don't matter. That's why, when debunked, feminism's political talking points are so persistent. The wage gap? Comprehensively and authoritatively debunked hundreds of times, and yet almost all women, and certainly all feminists, persist in believing that tired, worn-out falsehood. The same goes for almost any other significant feminist claim. Rape culture doesn't exist, except within the prison system against male and mostly black inmates, which is where the feminist movement stole the idea from, and then reframed it with the most privileged and protected citizens of Western nations cast as perpetual victims. The myth of rape culture doesn't bear up to even slight scrutiny or rational consideration, and yet it persists as a foundational story in the feminist vision. But the factual falsehood and the nakedly obvious unreality don't matter at all, because we are not dealing with a secular movement. We are dealing with religious mystics and fanatics who have so far succeeded in disguising their movement as a secular one, even as the excesses, the unapologetic fraud, the violence and the hatred and the criminality of feminism have drawn sharp public rebuke. But almost nobody seems to grasp that this is not a secular movement, it's a religious cult, and a highly successful one, because not even its low-level followers recognize it as a religion. That includes you as well, because you believe in at least some of this religion's doctrines without even realizing that they are religious doctrines. The patriarchy is not a secular claim about the distribution of power or influence in the world. It is a religious belief in what cannot be seen or measured or demonstrated to exist by any evidence. And in fact, feminists pointing to men in positions of apex political or financial power and then claiming, "There, you see, proof of patriarchy," those feminists are making exactly as much sense as a young earth creationist pointing to a complex natural structure and claiming that as proof of intelligent design. And I trust we don't need to have that argument again either. Separate from biological sex and sexual identity, the concept of gender, that point of so much contention and discussion, and about which nearly everybody has their own interpretation, is not a real thing. Gender is a baseless religious dogma. Sexual identity based in biology is real, but gender is a religious construct. You might think of your own gender as male or female or whatever else you can imagine, but it's imaginary. Just look at your genitals. That's your sexual identity. Your gender, whatever your concept of gender happens to be, is a religious myth. And of course, in the religious and mystical version of feminism, which is to say, the foundational movement, we are, as a species, moving towards a spiritual awakening and enlightenment. Femininity is the evolved, divine, spiritual nature of humanity, and masculinity is the atavistic animal nature to be left behind as we transcend our dirty animal needs and become one with divine knowledge, godhood, and nirvana. Oh yes, this is a utopian philosophy, and like all other utopias, it justifies any necessary brutalism to reach its paradise. And at least in the Western world, this spiritual feminism is not just a hidden and secret religion pretending to be a secular, humanist, or political movement. It is the dominant religion. So that's the whole reading. Thanks everybody for listening. And one more thing, just one. The online atheist community, which I used to be a part of, was basically taken over, infiltrated, and co-opted by what Atheism Plus, which is actually just feminism, social justice. And for a supposed rationalist, non-religionist online movement to have been so easily and so quickly and so completely co-opted by another religion and not even have anyone in that movement notice or understand that it's a religion is pathetic and embarrassing. So all of you former atheists who are now religionists, and by that I mean feminists, I'm coming for you. Just want to let you know. Thanks very much for watching, and have a lovely